Picture this. It's 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, and while most people are winding down, scrolling their phones, or letting the dishes sit just until morning, there's someone in your life, maybe a friend, maybe a coworker, maybe the person you share a home with, who is quietly wiping down the kitchen counter before they go to bed. Not because anyone is coming over, not because it's a special occasion, just because the counter is slightly sticky and they cannot go to sleep knowing that it is. Their shoes are lined up by the door, the pillows on the couch are straightened, there are no rogue coffee mugs on the desk, and if you ever walk into their home unannounced, it looks almost exactly the same as it would if they'd had 2 weeks of warning. Do you know someone like that? Or, and this might be the more uncomfortable question to sit with, is that actually you? Because if it is, here is something worth paying attention to. The story most people tell about this kind of person is that they are simply tidy or organized, or maybe even a little uptight. But that story is incomplete. What psychology has actually found about people who consistently keep their living spaces clean goes far deeper than a preference for neatness, and some of what it reveals is genuinely surprising, a little uncomfortable, and in certain ways, absolutely beautiful. Stay with this, because by the end, you might understand yourself or someone you love in a way you never quite have before. Most people look at someone who keeps a spotless home and think, wow, they really have it together. And in a lot of ways, that is true. There is real discipline there, real intentionality, a kind of low-level mastery over the immediate environment that most people genuinely admire and quietly wish they had. But here is what nobody talks about in the same breath. For a significant number of these people, the clean home is not just an aesthetic preference or a productivity habit. It is a regulation system, a way the nervous system has learned to manage something that lives much deeper than the surface of a countertop. The clean space is the gift. That part is real. But underneath the gift, for many people, is a psychological engine running in the background, one that was built not from freedom, but from need. And the two things coexist so naturally, so seamlessly, that the person living inside that pristine apartment often does not realize the engine is even there. Think of it this way. It looks like control. It functions like control. People praise it as control. But the question that psychology asks, and the question worth sitting with today, is this: what is it actually controlling? And where did that need come from? That is the real conversation, and it starts, like most things in human behavior, at the beginning. Psychology generally traces behavioral patterns like this back to 2 broad sources, and understanding which one applies to you, or to someone you know, changes everything about how you interpret what you're seeing. The first source is innate. Some people are simply wired with a nervous system that is more sensitive to environmental disorder. Research in neuropsychology has consistently shown that certain people have a higher baseline sensitivity to sensory input, visual clutter, ambient noise, physical disorganization, and their brain registers these things as genuinely taxing in a way that is not the case for everyone. This is not a personality flaw or an affectation. It is neurology. For these individuals, a messy room is not just aesthetically unpleasant, it creates a low-grade but persistent cognitive drain, like a program running in the background that your computer never fully closes. Cleaning is not a ritual for them, it is maintenance. The second source is formed, and this is where things get more psychologically layered. For a substantial number of people who maintain compulsively clean spaces, the behavior was learned, often in childhood, as a response to an environment that felt unpredictable, unsafe, or out of control. When a child grows up in a home where conflict is frequent, where a parent's moods are volatile, where there is financial stress or emotional chaos or instability of any kind, the child often finds one thing they can control: their immediate physical environment. Keeping their room spotless became a way to create a pocket of order inside a world that felt fundamentally disordered. And the nervous system remembered, when things around me are clean and organized, I feel safe. When they are not, something in me braces. That child grows up, The original source of the chaos is long gone, but the strategy the nervous system adopted, control the environment, regulate the fear, does not automatically retire just because the circumstances changed. And so the two branches look almost identical from the outside. Both produce a person who keeps an immaculate home, but the inner experience and the emotional cost can be profoundly different. Here is what matters most before we go any further, and this is something worth hearing clearly. You are not broken. If you recognize yourself in either of these origins, you are not someone with a dysfunction. You are someone whose mind built a very intelligent, very creative solution to the conditions it was given. You are carrying something, and today we are going to look at exactly what that something is. Now let's talk about what this actually looks like in daily life, not in clinical terms, but in the real, specific, quietly recognizable moments that make someone stop and think, wait, that is exactly me. The first sign is what we can call the arrival reset. There is a particular phenomenon that many clean environment people experience almost every time they come home, and it goes something like this. You walk through the door, you put down your bag, and before you do anything else, before you check your phone, before you eat, before you sit down, your eyes do a scan. Not consciously necessarily, but automatically.
And if something is out of place, a pillow that shifted, a glass left on the table, shoes that weren't returned to their spot, there is a subtle but distinct tension that settles into the body, something that doesn't fully release until that thing is corrected. The psychological concept at play here is called environmental appraisal, the brain's automatic, ongoing assessment of whether the surrounding space is safe and manageable. For most people, this appraisal is relatively low-key. For people who have trained their nervous system to use physical order as a proxy for emotional safety, the appraisal is running at a much higher sensitivity. The moment disorder is detected, the body registers it as something that needs to be resolved, not as a preference, but almost as a necessity. The consequence of this is that home, for these people, often does not feel fully like a place of rest until the space has been reset. There is a cost to that. It means the transition from out in the world to genuinely at ease has an extra step that other people simply do not have, and that step has to be completed before the nervous system is willing to relax. The second sign is hosting anxiety that has nothing to do with the guests. Imagine someone is coming over, a close friend, even someone the person genuinely loves and feels comfortable around. The invitation is extended freely, the relationship is warm, and yet in the hours before their arrival, there is a level of preparation happening that goes well beyond what the situation actually calls for. Surfaces are wiped that were already clean, items are repositioned, the bathroom gets a full treatment, even though nobody is going to notice the state of the bathroom. And here is the revealing part. If the person is asked what they're worried about, they often cannot name it with precision. They don't feel socially anxious exactly. They don't dislike the person who's coming. It's more of a diffuse urgency, a sense that things need to be right before another person enters the space, as though being seen inside a less than perfect environment would communicate something about them that they are not ready to have communicated. Psychologically, this is connected to identity fusion with the environment, the unconscious equating of one's living space with one's inner state. The clean home is not just a clean home, it is a presentation of self. Disorder in the space feels like disorder in the self. Being seen in that disorder feels, at some level, like being seen in a state of vulnerability that hasn't been consented to. The result is that hosting, something that should be easy and even joyful, becomes a performance with invisible criteria. The relief that comes after the guest leaves isn't just, it's quiet now. It's also, subtly, I can stop managing the image. The third sign is productivity prerequisite. This one is extraordinarily common among people in this category, and many of them have never quite named it. They cannot fully concentrate, cannot settle into work, cannot write the email or read the book or start the project until the space around them is organized to a certain standard. The desk needs to be clear, the kitchen needs to be dealt with, the laundry cannot be sitting there, visible, half-finished, while they try to do something else. And if those things are not handled first, there is a constant low-level pull, like a notification that won't stop pinging, that makes sustained focus feel genuinely out of reach. The scientific grounding for this is well established. Research from Princeton Neuroscience demonstrated that visual clutter directly competes for the brain's attentional resources, making it harder to maintain focus on any single task. But for people in the psychology we are exploring today, this effect is amplified because the clutter is not just visually distracting, it is emotionally activating. It is a signal that something is unresolved, and the brain, having learned to treat unresolved environments as threats, keeps redirecting attention towards it. The consequence is a specific kind of trap. The very act of cleaning becomes a prerequisite for the productivity that cleaning is supposedly creating space for. Hours can go by, the space gets perfect, and then the energy for the actual task has already been spent. The cleaning was never just cleaning. It was a coping mechanism that needed to run its full cycle before the nervous system felt safe enough to work. The fourth sign is disproportionate irritation at other people's mess. This one requires a certain honesty to acknowledge, but it is real, and it is worth exploring. A person who lives with a partner, a roommate, or children, someone who doesn't share the same relationship with cleanliness, will frequently experience a level of irritation at the other person's mess that they themselves recognize in calmer moments is somewhat out of proportion to the actual situation. A dish in the sink is not a catastrophe. A jacket left on the chair is not a crisis. And yet, in the moment of encountering these things, something in the body responds with an urgency that doesn't quite match the scale of the offense. There might be frustration, there might be a tightening feeling, there might be words exchanged that, in hindsight, were sharper than a jacket on a chair deserved. This is not fundamentally about cleanliness preferences.
It is about the fact that someone else's disorder is disrupting the person's primary regulation system. When you have learned to use your environment as an emotional stabilizer, someone casually dismantling that stabilizer without even knowing that is what they are doing triggers something that feels like more than just aesthetic annoyance. It feels like a loss of safety, and the response proportionally reflects that. The consequence in relationships is significant. Partners feel criticized. Children feel like they can never get it right, and the person doing the cleaning often ends up carrying a loneliness that comes from feeling like no one truly understands why this matters so much to them, because they themselves often can't fully explain it. The fifth sign is the post-cleaning calm. Here is something that almost everyone in this category will recognize immediately: the specific, physical sensation of relief and peace that sets in after cleaning a space that was bothering them. It is genuinely calming, not just satisfying in a job well done sense, but soothing in a way that has a distinct somatic quality. The shoulders drop, the breath deepens, something in the chest unclenches. This is not accidental, and it is not a coincidence. Cleaning, for the nervous system that has learned to use it as a regulation tool, triggers the same basic neurological pathway as other forms of anxiety relief. It is a completion behavior. The brain assigned a threat, the cleaning resolved the threat, and so the brain releases the tension it was holding. Dopamine is involved. The body is rewarded in a measurable chemical sense for having restored order. The reason this sign is worth paying attention to is not because the calm is bad. The calm is real, and there is nothing wrong with finding peace in a clean space. The reason it matters is that when cleaning becomes the primary tool for achieving nervous system regulation, it means the person has a very limited toolkit for managing stress in environments they cannot control: a messy office, a chaotic airport, someone else's home.
those spaces can become sources of anxiety not because they pose any actual threat, but because the person's go-to regulation strategy is simply unavailable. The sixth sign is the mental background noise. Ask most people who keep immaculate homes to describe what it feels like to be in a disorganized space for an extended period, like staying in a messy hotel room or spending time in a cluttered relative's house, and many of them will describe something remarkably similar, a kind of background noise in the mind that does not stop, a low-level unease, a difficulty being fully present in the conversation or the meal or the movie because some part of their attention is snagged on the disorganization around them in a way they cannot voluntarily release. This is the clearest window into what is actually happening neurologically. For these individuals, environmental disorder is not a neutral backdrop. It is an active input that the brain continues to process, assess, and register as requiring resolution. It is the psychological equivalent of a smoke detector going off at a very low volume, not loud enough to make normal conversation impossible, but persistent enough that you're never fully not hearing it. The result is a quieter but pervasive kind of exhaustion, not from doing too much, but from perceiving too much, from having a nervous system that is always at some low level monitoring the environment for disorder and waiting for the signal that it is safe to stop. The seventh sign, and in many ways the most telling, is this. When something emotionally significant happens, cleaning is often the first thing the person reaches for. A difficult conversation, a stressful day at work, bad news received, a fight that hasn't been resolved, and within an hour the apartment is being cleaned. Not because it was dirty, not because cleaning was already on the agenda, but because something needed to be managed, and this is the tool the nervous system knows how to use. There is a genuine intelligence to this strategy. It works in the short term. The cleaning provides real relief. But the consequence is that the emotional content of the original event, the difficult conversation, the unresolved conflict, the grief or fear or anger, never quite gets processed. It gets organized around. And over time, things that have been organized around rather than moved through have a way of accumulating. Here is what tends to happen when these patterns run long enough without being named, and this is the part that rarely gets talked about. When cleaning and environmental control become a primary nervous system regulation tool over many years, the brain begins to do something that feels helpful but is actually quietly limiting. It starts to equate order in the space with order in the self so thoroughly that the person loses fluency in other forms of emotional regulation. They become, in a specific and important way, environment dependent for their sense of well-being. When the space is clean, they feel capable, grounded, and in control. When it isn't, when life delivers them a situation they genuinely cannot tidy up, they often find themselves with very little access to the inner calm that other people can generate without any external conditions being met. There is also a subtler escalation that happens in relationships. Because the clean space is functionally an emotional regulation system, anyone who consistently disrupts it, even innocently, even lovingly, begins to register in the nervous system as a source of threat rather than a source of comfort. The partner who leaves their mug on the counter is not just leaving a mug on the counter. They are, neurologically speaking, destabilizing something that functions like a security system. And the cumulative effect of that is that intimacy, real, relaxed, mess-allowed intimacy, becomes quietly harder to access because intimacy requires a tolerance for imperfection and disorder that the nervous system has been trained to treat as dangerous. This is not where the story ends, but it is the layer that needs to be seen clearly because you cannot navigate around something you have not yet named.
Here is the thing that is important to hold on to before anything else. You cannot simply decide to stop caring about your environment, and that is not what healing looks like. The goal is not to become someone who lives in chaos and calls it growth. The goal is to give yourself more options, to expand the toolkit so that the clean space can be something you genuinely love and choose, rather than something you need in order to feel okay. Those are very different experiences of the same behavior. One is freedom, the other is dependence. And the difference between them is not the cleanliness, it is the internal state that the cleanliness is serving. The first principle is learning to distinguish preference from need. The first, and perhaps most important shift, is developing the ability to notice in real time whether you are cleaning from a place of genuine desire, I love a clear space and I am choosing to create one, or from a place of internal pressure, I cannot settle until this is handled. The behavior may look identical from the outside, but inside the body they feel completely different. One has ease in it, the other has urgency. Practicing the simple act of pausing before cleaning and asking, "What am I feeling right now that this is going to address?" is not about talking yourself out of cleaning. It is about building self-knowledge, understanding your own interior weather well enough to recognize when you are reaching for a tool versus when a tool is reaching for you. The second principle is building portable regulation strategies. Because the core dynamic here is nervous system regulation through environmental control, the most genuinely helpful thing you can do for yourself over time is develop regulation strategies that work independent of your environment. This means practices like breathwork, physical movement, deliberate time in nature, body-based grounding techniques, anything that communicates safety to the nervous system through a channel that is not the state of the room you are standing in. This is not a replacement for your relationship with your space. It is an expansion. The goal is to be someone who can find their footing in a messy hotel room, in a difficult conversation, in an airport, in all the situations where the external environment cannot be controlled, and still have something internal to come back to. The third principle is renegotiating the relationship between your space and your safety. For those who recognize the childhood origin in what they've heard today, the pattern of using a clean environment as a sanctuary from early chaos, there is deeper, slower work available, and it is worth it. That work involves, at its core, teaching the nervous system that safety is not located in the countertop. It lives inside you. The clean space can be beautiful, intentional, and genuinely yours without being the only place you feel okay. Therapy, particularly approaches like EMDR, somatic therapy, or attachment-informed work, can be extraordinarily helpful for people doing this specific kind of rewiring. But even without formal therapeutic support, simply naming the pattern, saying out loud or writing down, "I learned to feel safe through order, and that made sense when I was young, and I am allowed to update this strategy now," begins something. It begins the process of carrying your sense of safety differently. Your relationship with your space is not a problem to be solved. It is a language your nervous system developed, a very specific, very personal dialect of "I need to feel okay." And like all languages, it contains both beauty and limitation. The beauty is real. There is genuine artistry in a home that is tended with care, genuine warmth in a space that someone has made deliberate and clean and welcoming. That capacity, the capacity to create order, to steward an environment, to make a space feel safe, is something worth honoring, not pathologizing. But think of it this way. A river that has been carved into one narrow channel over many years moves powerfully, but it can only go in one direction. The work, if you choose it, is not to dam the river or change its nature. It is to gently widen the banks so that the same water, the same essential nature, can move with more ease in more directions and reach more of the places that need it. The person who keeps their house clean is not someone who needs to become messier. They are someone who, perhaps, gets to discover that the peace they have spent years building into their environment was always, quietly, inside them too, and that it does not require a clean counter to exist. It just needed the right conditions to remember that it was always there. If something in this video landed for you, if you recognized yourself in the arrival scan, or the hosting anxiety, or the way cleaning is sometimes the first thing you reach for when something is wrong, drop a comment below and tell me which sign hit closest to home. Not because there is anything wrong with you, but because the moment you name a pattern, you have already begun to change your relationship to it. And sometimes it helps to know that you are not the only person sitting with this particular quiet. And if there is someone in your life, a partner, a friend, a family member, who you have sometimes struggled to understand around this topic, consider sharing this with them, not as a diagnosis, just as a door. Because sometimes the most useful thing is not an answer, it's a conversation that finally has the right words.